Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are shifting gears a bit. When we think about human biology, we usually focus on the engines, you know.
The flashy parts.
Exactly. The heart pumping, the brain firing, muscles contracting. But today we're focusing on the quiet regulator in the background, the master decision maker. We're talking about the kidney.
You know, you could make a really strong case that it's the most intelligent organ in the body. I know that sounds like hyperbole, but if you actually look at the sheer computational power that's required to keep you in balance, the kidney is just unrivaled.
I think most of us, myself included, have the completely wrong mental model for this organ. We think of it as, well, plumbing.
The drain.
It's a drain. You pour liquid in the top, it comes out the bottom. But digging into the sources for today, specifically Katzung and Trevor's basic and clinical pharmacology, and of course, Goodman and Gilman's Caroprol, the pharmacological basis of therapeutics, that plumbing analogy it completely falls apart.
Instantly. It's the passive filter myth. And if the kidney were just a passive drain, I mean, you'd be dead in, 45 minutes?
Right, because of the sheer volume we're talking about. I was looking at the numbers in the intro to the renal chapter, and they're just mind-boggling.
They really are. Let's just put some numbers on it. The kidney filters the entire extracellular fluid volume of your body.
So that's all your blood plasma, all the fluid between your cells.
Everything. It filters all of that an average of 12 times a day.
12 times. So if it were just a drain, you'd literally urinate your entire body weight out before lunch.
You'd be a pile of dust. So it's not a drain. It's an incredibly high-velocity processing plant. It takes everything out, water, salt, glucose, all the electrolytes. And then for every single one of those molecules, it has to make a split-second decision.
Keep it or let it go.
Do I keep this or do I excrete it? And that one decision, repeated billions of times a minute, is what determines your blood pressure, your electrolyte balance, your body's pH, your survival, really.
So the whole mission for this deep dive, then, is to understand how we as clinicians can hack that decision-making process. We're talking about Pharma 25, renal excretion, which really means we're talking about diuretics. But even that word diuretic feels like a misnomer after reading these chapters.
It is. It's just the downstream effect. It's like calling a lumberjack a sawdust maker. What these drugs really are transport inhibitors. They are, let's say, molecular wrenches that we throw into very specific gears in that processing plant.
And by jamming those gears, we can sculpt the volume and the composition of the body's fluids.
Sculpting is the perfect word. It's intentional. You're shaping something. You're not just, opening a faucet.
Okay, so to do that, to understand the sculpting, we need a map. We can't just memorize a list of drugs. We have to understand the terrain. What's our roadmap for today? What are the key takeaways?
I think we can boil it down to 5 core concepts. First, and this is the most important, we need to see the nephron as a map. In renal pharmacology, it is all about location, location, location. The site where a drug acts determines literally everything about it.
Its power, its side effects, everything.
Everything. Because the nephron isn't just one uniform tube, it's segmented, and each segment does a different job.
Okay, that's one.
Second, we have to grapple with what the books call the braking phenomenon. This is huge. The kidney is a living system. When you hit it with a drug, it doesn't just passively accept it.
It fights back.
It fights back. It adapts. It remodels. And understanding that counterattack is the key to understanding drug tolerance and diuretic resistance.
That's the part in Goodman and Gilman that blew my mind. The idea that the cells literally get bigger, they hypertrophy to overcome the drug's effect.
It's incredible biology. Okay, third concept. We have to bust the myth of the water pill. These drugs aren't primarily about water. They're about sodium. Sodium is the currency of the kidney. If you can't control sodium, you can't control volume, period.
Water just follows the salt.
Always. Fourth, we'll call it the electrolyte web. You can't just touch one thing in the kidney. You move sodium, and that forces a change in potassium. You move chloride, and that changes calcium handling. It's all interconnected, and we have to be able to predict those secondary movements.
Because that's where the danger lies, the side effects.
That's where the iatrogenic harm comes from, absolutely. And then finally, we'll put it all together. We'll synthesize this into clinical reasoning. How do we actually choose a drug? How do we use concepts like sequential blockade to treat a patient who is, becoming resistant to therapy?
From the molecule to the bedside.
That's the goal.
Great. And before we dive in, just the usual disclaimer. This is our interpretive synthesis of the material. We're building a conceptual map. We really want you to use this deep dive as a framework, as a guide, so that when you go back and read these chapters in Katsung and Goodman and Gilman, and you absolutely should read them, you'll have the landscape already laid out.
We are the tour guides. The books are the territory.
All right, let's start with section 1, the landscape. Let's draw that nephron map. We've got about 1 million of these microscopic tubules in each kidney. And as you said, it's not a uniform pipe. It has distinct neighborhoods.
Think of it like a disassembly and reassembly line. It starts at the glomerulus. That's the big filter. It's pretty indiscriminate. It just dumps a huge volume of plasma minus the cells and big proteins into the top of the tubule. That's called the ultrafiltrate.
So that's the raw material. And then immediately, the rescue mission begins. Body has to frantically pull back all the good stuff that just dumped out before it gets lost to the bladder.
Frantically is the right word. And Katsung gives us the numbers to track this, specifically by tracking sodium. Because remember, where sodium goes, water obediently follows.
So station number 1 on the map, the proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT.
This is the workhorse, the absolute bulk handler. This first segment, right after the filter, reabsorbs about 65% of all the filtered sodium.
65%, 2/3 of the entire job.
And it doesn't stop there. It grabs 85% of the bicarbonate, which is your main acid-base buffer, and basically 100% of your valuable nutrients, like glucose and amino acids.
So it's high volume, but kind of low specificity. It's just grabbing everything it can as fast as it can.
Exactly. Now, station 2 on our map, we go down into the loop of Henle, specifically the thick ascending limb of the loop, the TL.
And what's its job?
This is the engine that creates the kidney's ability to concentrate urine. It's a huge player in sodium handling. It reabsorbs another 15 to 25% of the filtered sodium load.
Okay, so between the PCT and the TL, we've already reclaimed, what, 85 to 90% of the sodium?
We're almost home, which brings us to station 3, the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT.
The fine-tuner.
Now we're into the fine-tuning. The DCT is a smaller player. It only handles about 4 to 8% of the sodium, but it's a really important hormonally regulated site.
And the final stop, station 4.
The collecting duct. This is the final checkpoint. It handles the last little bit, maybe 2 to 5% of the sodium. But this is where the moment-to-moment high-precision regulation happens. This is where hormones like aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone make their final decisions.
So if we lay out that map, we have this descending order of magnitude. 65%, then 25%, then maybe 5-8%, then 2-5% at the very end. And that geographical distribution, that is the key to understanding diuretic potency.
It explains everything. If you block a transporter way at the end of the line, in the collecting duct, you're only tinkering with 2% of the total sodium flow. It's going to be a weak effect.
But if you block something way up at the beginning...
You're theoretically interfering with 65% of the flow, which should be a massive effect.
But it's not. And this is the paradox that leads us straight into section 2. The drugs that work on the proximal tubule, the 65% workhorse. The books all say they are weak diuretics. It seems completely counterintuitive.
It absolutely does on the surface. We're talking about the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors here. The classic example is acetazolamide.
Okay, let's break down the mechanism first. Carbonic anhydrase, or CA. What is this enzyme actually doing in the proximal tubule?
Let's do a little bit of chemistry. The big job of the PCT, besides sodium, is to reabsorb sodium bicarbonate, NaHCO3. That's your body's main buffer against getting too acidic.
It's like baking soda for the blood.
Exactly. But bicarbonate is a charged ion. It's bulky. It can't just diffuse across the cell membrane from the urine back into the blood, so the cell has to play a trick.
A chemical sleight of hand.
Right. The cell pumps a proton, a hydrogen ion, H+, out into the urine. That proton combines with the bicarbonate HCO3 in the urine. And with the help of carbonic anhydrase on the cell surface, they turn into CO2 and water.
Ah, and CO2 is a gas. It can just diffuse right into the cell.
Effortlessly. Then, once inside the cell, another carbonic anhydrase enzyme reverses the reaction, turning the CO2 back into bicarbonate, which then gets transported into the blood.
So it's a revolving door. You secrete an acid to reclaim a base.
Perfect analogy. Now, acetazolamide comes along, and it jams that revolving door. It inhibits the enzyme, so you can't secrete the proton efficiently. You can't convert the bicarbonate into CO2, so the bicarbonate gets trapped in the urine.
And it just gets flushed out.
It gets flushed out. So you're dumping this alkaline molecule. The result is, 1, your urine becomes very alkaline, very high pH, and 2, because you're losing base from your blood, the patient develops a metabolic acidosis.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's go back to the central question. Why is it a weak diuretic? We just blocked the process that's tied to 65% of sodium reabsorption.
And this is where the map becomes so important. You're right. You've blocked the first biggest exit on the highway.
So all that traffic, all that sodium and water that wasn't reabsorbed, it has to go somewhere.
It's forced to continue downstream to the next exit, the loop of Henle.
And the loop of Henle, under normal circumstances, isn't working at full capacity.
Not even close. It has a massive reserve capacity. The tail looks upstream, sees this unexpected flood of sodium coming its way, and it just ramps up its activity. It says, no problem, I got this. It starts pumping sodium like crazy.
So the downstream segment completely compensates for the upstream blockade.
Almost completely. It rescues the vast majority of the sodium that the proximal tubule rejected. So by the time the fluid finally makes it all the way to the bladder, the net increase in sodium loss is actually pretty small.
The body outsmarts the drug. That is a fantastic systems-level insight. The redundancy is built in.
It is, and that's why we almost never use acetazolamide as a primary diuretic for something like heart failure or edema. The loop just laughs at it and cleans up the mess.
So we use it for its side effects, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. We use it for glaucoma because the same chemistry is involved in making the aqueous humor in the eye. You inhibit Ca, you make less fluid, you lower eye pressure. Or we use it for altitude sickness, because inducing that mild metabolic acidosis actually stimulates your respiratory drive, which helps you acclimatize. But as a water pill, it's a dud.
A dud with some significant baggage, too. Cadsung is pretty clear on the toxicity. You mentioned the alkaline urine.
Yes, and this is simple chemistry. There's a salt called calcium phosphate. And calcium phosphate is not very soluble in alkaline solutions. So if you make the urine persistently alkaline,
it precipitates. It forms crystals.
Which then clump together and form kidney stones. A very predictable side effect.
And we also need to establish a rule here that's going to come up again and again. You called it the golden rule of potassium.
Yes. Stamp this into your brain. Any diuretic that increases sodium delivery to the far end of the nephron to the collecting duct will cause potassium wasting.
Okay, why?
Because the collecting duct, that final checkpoint, has a trade-off mechanism. Its job, when stimulated by aldosterone, is to reabsorb sodium. But to do that, to maintain electrical balance, it has to secrete or dump a positive ion in exchange, and its ion of choice is potassium.
So if you block sodium reabsorption upstream with acetazolamide, you're essentially sending a huge wave of sodium rushing down to the collecting duct.
And the collecting duct cells get very excited. They see all this sodium, they go into overdrive absorbing it, and to pay for it, they just dump potassium into the urine.
So acetazolamide causes hypokalemia, low blood potassium.
It does. And as we're about to see, so do the loop diuretics and the thiazide diuretics. It's a class effect of anything working upstream.
Well, that's a perfect transition. Let's move to section 3, the heavy lifters, the loop diuretics. Furosemide, bumetanide, torsemide. Lasix is the brand name everyone knows.
Now we're moving down to that thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Now we're getting serious.
These are called high-ceiling diuretics. What does that mean, and why are they so powerful?
Two main reasons. First, as we said, the loop handles a huge chunk of sodium up to 25%. That's a big target. But the second reason is the crucial one. Unlike the proximal tubule, the segments that come after the loop, the DCT, and the collecting duct, do not have the capacity to rescue a massive sodium load.
Ah, so there's no backup system this time. If the loop rejects the sodium, the distal tubule just gets overwhelmed.
It gets steamrolled, the floodgates are open, and that torrent of sodium and water has nowhere to go but out into the urine. You can get a massive diuresis. I mean, liters and liters of fluid. This is why we use them for emergencies, like acute pulmonary edema, where you're literally drowning in your own fluid.
So let's look at the molecular wrench. What's the specific target?
The target is a protein called the Na plus NASHDO-K plus NASHNO2C low importer. We just call it NKCC2. It sits on the luminal, or urine side of the cell, and it grabs 1 sodium, 1 potassium, and 2 chloride ions and pulls them all into the cell together.
And the loop diuretic molecule.
It physically binds to the chloride binding site on that protein and just jams it, shuts it down completely.
Okay, now Goodman and Gilman goes into this really elegant secondary mechanism that makes loops so uniquely powerful. It has to do with something called the tubulo-glomerular feedback, or TGF.
Yes, this is the blinding the sensor concept. It's brilliant. So the kidney has a built-in safety brake. Just past the loop of Henle, there's a specialized patch of cells called the macula densa. Think of it as a salt sensor.
It's tasting the urine as it flows by.
Exactly. And if it tastes too much salt, too much sodium chloride, it sends a signal back to the glomerulus at the beginning of the nephron. It says, hey, we're losing too much salt. Turn down the filtration rate.
So it constricts the afferent arteriole, drops the GFR, and reduces the amount of fluid being filtered in the first place. It's a negative feedback loop to prevent excess salt loss.
A perfect negative feedback loop. But here's the trick. Loop diuretics are sneaky. The macula densa cells use the exact same NKCC2 transporter to sense the salt.
Oh, so the diuretic blocks the transporter that reabsorbs the salt, but it also blocks the transporter that senses the salt.
It blinds the sensor. The macula densa is swimming in a sea of salt, but because its transporter is jammed by furosemide, it can't taste it. It thinks the tubule is empty.
So instead of telling the glomerulus to slow down,
It tells the glomerulus, everything's fine, keep filtering at maximum speed.
that is just diabolical. You block the reabsorption, and you simultaneously disable the body's main safety brake against that blockade.
That is precisely why they're called high-ceiling diuretics. You can just keep giving more and getting more effect because you've disabled the acute braking system.
But the body's clever. The braking system doesn't stay disabled forever. This brings us back to the braking phenomenon in the chronic setting. You call it tolerance.
Right. This is the long-term adaptation. If you put a patient on furosemide every single day, the effect you get on day 1 is way more dramatic than the effect you get on day 30. The body starts to fight back. It senses this chronic volume depletion, and it freaks out.
Activates all the compensatory systems.
Yeah.
The sympathetic nervous system, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, RAAS.
All of it. But then there's the structural change, which is the really cool part. The cells of the distal convoluted tubule, the very next segment downstream, they undergo hypertrophy.
They literally get bigger and stronger.
They bulk up, they grow in size, they pack themselves with more mitochondria for energy, and they synthesize and install more of their own sodium transporters. The kidney effectively builds a bigger, stronger dam downstream to catch the flood that the blocked loop is letting through.
That is such a profound concept. The organ physically remodels itself to counteract a pharmacological intervention.
It's a cellular arms race, and this explains diuretic resistance. Eventually, that hypertrophied distal segment becomes so efficient that it reabsorbs almost everything the loop diuretic blocks, and the patient stops responding.
And we'll get to how we solve that problem in a bit. But before we leave the loops, we have to talk about the other ions, specifically calcium.
This is a critical point of contrast. We said acetazolamide doesn't do much. Loop diuretics cause massive sodium and potassium loss. And this is key, they also cause calcium loss.
They make you waste calcium.
Why? It's an electrical phenomenon. The action of that NKCC2 transporter normally creates a slight positive electrical charge in the lumen, in the urine. And since charges repel, that positive luminal charge physically pushes other positive ions like calcium, Ca2+, and magnesium, Mg2+, between the cells and back into the blood.
It's called paracellular reabsorption. It's driven by that electrical gradient.
Exactly. But when you block NKCC2 with furosemide, you abolish that transporter's activity. The battery dies. That positive charge in the lumen disappears.
And without the electrical push, the calcium and magnesium just stay in the urine.
And get flushed away, which has huge clinical implications.
Right. So let's synthesize. If you have a postmenopausal patient with osteopenia or osteoporosis, and you put them on a high-dose loop diuretic long-term,
You're actively contributing to their bone loss. You're leaching calcium from their body every single day. On the flip side, if you have a patient with dangerous hypercalcemia, say from a cancer, a loop diuretic is a fantastic treatment. You can literally force their kidneys to dump that excess calcium.
Okay, one final point on loops. Drug interactions. There's a big warning in both books about NSAIDs, ibuprofen, naproxen, things like that.
Yes. NSAIDs are the enemy of the sick kidney. Here's why. Prostaglandins, which are blocked by NSAIDs, are actually really important for maintaining blood flow to the kidney, especially when the body is stressed. They help keep the afferent arteriole dilated.
And loop diuretics actually depend on this.
They do. Part of their effect involves stimulating local prostaglandin production to help preserve renal blood flow in the face of volume loss. So if a patient takes their Lasix with a big dose of Advil...
The NSAI blocks the protective prostaglandin effect.
Right. You clamp down on the blood flow of the kidney, you can dramatically blunt the diuretic response, and in a really fragile patient, you can even tip them into acute renal failure.
Okay. We've covered the workhorse and the heavy lifters. Let's move further down the map to section 4. The fine-tuners. The thiazide diuretics. Hydrochlorothiazide, chlorthalidone, metolazone.
We're now in the distal convoluted tubule, the DCT.
And the molecular target here is different.
It is. It's the sodium chloride symporter, which we call NCC. It just pulls one sodium and one chloride in together.
And these are known as low-ceiling diuretics.
They are. And it goes back to our map. The DCT is only responsible for reabsorbing maybe 4 to 8% of the total filtered sodium. So even if you block its transporter 100%, you're just not going to get the massive volume shifts you see with a loop diuretic. The ceiling for the effect is much lower.
Yet they are still the first-line drug for uncomplicated hypertension for millions of people.
They are, because for hypertension, you don't want a massive diuresis. You want a gentle, sustained effect. They're mild, they have long half-lives, and it turns out they also have some direct vasodilatory effects that help lower blood pressure beyond just volume removal.
But there's a big caveat that Katsung really stresses, a major limitation, the GFR floor.
The magic number is 30, a GFR of 30 milliliters per minute.
Which is pretty advanced, stage 4 chronic kidney disease.
Right. And the general rule is once a patient's kidney function declines below that level, thiazide diuretics basically stop working. They lose all their efficacy.
Why is that? Is it a delivery problem?
It's partly that they have trouble getting secreted into the tubule to reach their site of action, and it's partly that with such a low flow rate through the nephron, blocking a small distal transporter just doesn't make much of a difference anymore.
So loops still work in renal failure, but thiazides don't.
Exactly. With one important exception, which is metolazone. It's a thiazide-like diuretic that, for reasons that aren't perfectly clear, retains its efficacy even in patients with very poor renal function. It's a bit of a special case.
Okay, let's talk about the calcium paradox. This is fascinating. We just established that loops make you lose calcium. Thiazides do the exact opposite.
They do. Thiazides make you retain calcium. They enhance its reabsorption from the urine back into the blood.
That seems so counterintuitive. They're both diuretics that block sodium reabsorption. Why would they have opposite effects on calcium?
The mechanism is completely different and really clever. So in the DCT cell, when you block the main sodium entry point with a thiazide, the inside of the cell becomes relatively low in sodium. The cell gets sodium hungry.
And it looks for another way to get sodium in?
It does. On the other side of the cell, the blood side, there's a different transporter, an exchanger, and it gets upregulated. This exchanger pulls sodium into the cell from the blood, and to pay for it, it pumps calcium out of the cell into the blood.
So it creates a calcium gradient, pulling more calcium from the urine into the cell to feed that exchanger.
That's exactly it. The net effect is that you actively reclaim calcium from the urine. So going back to our patient with osteoporosis.
A thiazide would actually be a good choice. It's bone protective.
It is. So you have this beautiful clinical dichotomy: loops lose calcium, thiazides save calcium.
But thiazides aren't without their own problems. We still have the potassium issue, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're still upstream of the collecting duct. We're blocking sodium reabsorption in the DCT, which means more sodium is delivered to the end of the line. The collecting duct sees it, grabs it, and dumps potassium in exchange. Hypokalemia is a very, very common side effect.
And what about the risk of gout?
Yes, the organic acid competition. This is a big one. It applies to both loops and thiazides, but we often think about it with thiazides because they're used so commonly for long-term hypertension.
So break it down. What's happening?
The kidney has a specific set of transporters in the proximal tubule whose job is to secrete organic acids from the blood into the urine. It's an active process. The diuretic drug needs to use this transport system to get into the tubule so it can float downstream to its site of action.
So the drug has to get into the urine to work.
Correct. But uric acid, the molecule that causes gout, is also an organic acid. It uses the exact same transporter system to get excreted from the body.
It's a traffic jam at the doorway.
It's a bottleneck. The transporter is busy secreting high doses of the diuretic, so there's less capacity to secrete uric acid. The uric acid gets left behind, its levels rise in the blood. That's hyperuricemia.
And in a susceptible person, that can precipitate into sharp crystals in a joint and trigger an excruciatingly painful gout attack.
Exactly. So if you're starting a patient with a known history of gout on a thiazide, you have to be really cautious and monitor their uric acid levels.
Okay. Let's travel to the very end of our map, section 5. The final checkpoint, the collecting duct. We've been blaming this section for potassium loss the whole time. Now let's talk about the drugs that actually work here.
These are the potassium-sparing diuretics and the aldosterone antagonists.
And the central tension here is that trade-off we discussed. The body, especially when stressed, uses the hormone aldosterone to tell the collecting duct to save sodium at all costs. But the price for saving that sodium is dumping potassium.
So if we can block that final transaction,
We get a mild diuretic effect because we let that last 2 to 5% of sodium escape. But crucially, we prevent the potassium from being dumped. We spare the potassium.
exactly. And we have two different ways to hit the brakes here.
Let's start with the first class.
These are the direct channel blockers, amiloride and triamterene. They work on a protein called ENAC, the epithelial sodium channel. This is the door that sodium uses to enter the cell from the urine. These drugs are, for all intents and purposes, a cork. They just physically plug the channel.
Simple, direct, mechanical.
Very simple. Fast on, fast off. But then you have the more sophisticated class, the aldosterone antagonists. The main ones are spironolactone and eplerenone.
And these are working one step higher up the chain. They aren't blocking the channel itself.
No, they're blocking the signal that tells the cell to make the channel in the first place. They are mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists. Aldosterone is a steroid hormone. It floats into the cell, binds to its receptor in the cytoplasm, and the whole complex travels to the nucleus and alters gene transcription.
It's telling the cell's DNA, build more sodium channels, build more of the pumps that keep the whole system running.
Exactly. Spironolactone binds to that same receptor but doesn't activate it. It's a competitive antagonist. It prevents aldosterone from delivering its message.
But the timing of that must be completely different.
It is. If you block a channel with amiloride, the effect is almost immediate. But with spironolactone, you're not destroying existing channels. You're just stopping the synthesis of new ones. You have to wait for the old proteins to naturally turn over and degrade. It can take several days to see the full clinical effect.
So we wouldn't use these drugs by themselves for, say, acute edema.
Right.
They're just too weak.
As standalone diuretics, they're pathetic. They only affect that last tiny fraction of sodium. But they are incredibly important for two other reasons. The first is synergy. We add them to a loop or a thiazide specifically to counteract the potassium wasting.
You combine the potassium-wasting drug with the potassium-sparing drug to find a balance.
It's a very common and effective strategy. But the second reason is probably even more important, and it has to do with heart failure.
This is a key point. This is where the drug becomes more than just a diuretic. It's a disease-modifying agent.
It is. It turns out that chronically elevated aldosterone levels don't just affect the kidney. Aldosterone also acts directly on the heart and blood vessels, promoting fibrosis, scarring, and pathological remodeling. In a patient with heart failure, giving an aldosterone antagonist like spironolactone has been shown in huge clinical trials to reduce mortality.
So it saves lives, not just by making them pee, but by protecting the heart muscle itself from becoming stiff and scarred.
Precisely. It's one of the cornerstones of modern heart failure therapy. But, and this is a big but, there is a significant danger.
Hyperkalemia.
Too much potassium. If you block the exit route for potassium too effectively, or if the patient's kidneys aren't working well to begin with, the potassium levels in the blood can rise to dangerous levels.
And high potassium is extremely dangerous for the heart's electrical system.
It can cause fatal cardiac arrhythmias, ventricular fibrillation, a systole. It's a true medical emergency. So you have to monitor the patient's potassium levels very, very carefully.
And with spironolactone specifically, there's that one notorious side effect we have to mention.
Gynecomastia, breast tissue development in men. Spironolactone is what we'd call a dirty drug. It's not very selective. It blocks the aldosterone receptor, which is what we want, but also has affinity for androgen receptors, where it acts as an antagonist.
It blocks testosterone's effects.
Right, which can lead to gynecomastia, impotence, and decreased libido. It's a very common reason for men to stop taking the drug.
And that's why we have its cousin, eplerenone.
Exactly. Eplerenone was designed to be much more selective for the mineralocorticoid receptor. It has very little activity at androgen receptors, so it doesn't cause those endocrine side effects. The trade-off is that it's often much more expensive.
Okay, let's briefly touch on Section 6, water handling. We have obsessed about salt. What about drugs that specifically target pure water?
There are really two oddball classes here, the osmotic diuretics and the aquaretics.
Let's start with osmotics. The prototype is mannitol. This doesn't block a transporter at all, does it?
No, it works by a purely physical mechanism. Mannitol is a large sugar alcohol. You inject it intravenously. It gets freely filtered at the glomerulus into the tubule, but the kidney has no way to reabsorb it, so it gets trapped in the urine.
And it acts like a sponge or a magnet.
A magnet is a great way to think of it. It's an osmotically active particle. By the laws of osmosis, water will move to dilute it, So mannitol effectively holds water in the tubule by its osmotic force and prevents it from being reabsorbed.
But there's a very dangerous initial phase with mannitol.
There is. Before it even gets to the kidney, when it's first circulating in your bloodstream, it exerts that same osmotic force there. It literally sucks water out of your cells and tissues and pulls it into your blood vessels.
So it acutely expands your plasma volume.
Dramatically and rapidly. And you can see why this would be lethal in a patient with congestive heart failure. You could instantly flood their lungs and cause acute pulmonary edema.
So where do we actually use it?
Its main niche is in neurocritical care. We use it to reduce intracranial pressure by sucking water out of a swollen brain.
Okay. And the other class? The aquaretics, the vaptins.
A much newer class. Drugs like tolvaptan. These are much more targeted. They are antagonists of the V2 receptor for antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, in the collecting duct.
ADH is the hormone that tells the kidney to conserve water.
Right. It does that by causing little water channels called aquaporins to be inserted into the cell membrane. Vaptins block that signal. The water channels don't get inserted.
So sodium reabsorption can proceed as normal, but the water can't follow. It's trapped.
Correct. You excrete pure water, or free water, without losing salt. This makes them incredibly useful for treating certain types of hyponatremia where the patient has too much water relative to their sodium.
All right. We have our map. We have our tools. Let's get to section 7. Clinical synthesis. Let's put this all together and think like a clinician.
It has to start with understanding the underlying pathophysiology. The concept Goodman and Gilman calls the pressure-natriuresis relationship.
Which basically says that in a healthy person, if your blood pressure rises, your kidney automatically excretes more sodium to bring it back down.
It's a self-correcting system, but in disease states like heart failure or cirrhosis, that relationship is broken. The curve is shifted to the right.
The body is confused. In severe heart failure, the heart pump is weak, so the forward blood flow and pressure are low. The kidney sensors just read low volume.
And it thinks the body is bleeding out. It panics and does the only thing it knows how to do. It cranks up every system to retain sodium and water.
Which is the absolute worst thing it could do. The patient is already drowning in fluid, and the kidney is desperately trying to add more, which just stretches the failing heart even further. It's a vicious cycle.
It is. So the diuretic is the tool we use to break that cycle. We use a powerful loop diuretic to force the kidney to let go of that salt and water. We reduce the preload, the volume returning to the heart, and by taking that stretch off the cardiac muscle, we can actually move it back to a more efficient point on its performance curve.
But what about the patient we mentioned earlier, the one on high-dose furosemide who eventually stops responding? The diuretic resistance.
This is where we have to pull out the big guns. The strategy is called sequential nephron blockade.
Walk us through that.
Okay, so your patient has been on Lasix for months or years. Their distal tubule has hypertrophied. It's become a superabsorber. It's now so efficient that it's catching almost all the sodium that the loop diuretic is blocking upstream. So what do?
You have to block that hypertrophied segment too.
You add a second diuretic that works at that site. You add a thiazide, classically metolazone, on top of the loop diuretic.
You block the first major exit, and then you block the escape route.
It's a devastating 1-2 punch. You block the loop, which sends a tidal wave of sodium downstream, and then you block the distal tubule, which is waiting there with its mouth wide open to catch it. The sodium has absolutely nowhere to go.
And the result must be a massive diuresis.
It can be truly profound. You can get liters and liters of urine out of a patient who was previously resistant. But it is incredibly dangerous. You can cause catastrophic dehydration, circulatory collapse, and life-threatening electrolyte abnormalities, especially hypokalemia. It has to be done in a hospital with very close monitoring.
What about the other end of the spectrum, the patient with end-stage renal disease, GFR of, say, 15?
We already said thiazides are useless there, so we have to rely on loops. But we have to use them in a totally different way. We have to overcome that delivery problem.
The competition at the organic acid transporter.
Exactly. In severe kidney failure, the blood is full of uremic toxins. These are all organic acids, and they are clogging the secretory pathway that furosemide needs to use to get into the urine.
So the drug is in the blood, but it can't get to the job site inside the tubule.
Right. So giving a normal dose does nothing. In these patients, we have to give enormous intravenous doses, 200, 400 milligrams, just to create a high enough concentration gradient to force a tiny little bit of the drug past the competition and into the tubule to have an effect.
So it's not drug resistance at the level of the cell. It's a pharmacokinetic delivery failure.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Goodman and Gilman puts all this logic together into something called Brader's algorithm.
Which is really just a formal way of thinking through the problem systematically. First, are you sure you've addressed the underlying problem and that the patient is actually restricting their sodium intake? Because if they're eating potato chips, you'll never win.
No diuretic can outpee a bad diet.
Never. Second, choose the right class of drug based on their kidney function, their GFR. Third, titrate the dose appropriately, understanding the dose-response curve. It's about using physiology to guide therapy, not just prescribing out of habit.
This all brings us to a final, I think, provocative thought. As clinicians, we spend so much time staring at the plastic urine collection bag at the foot of the bed. We write down the output every hour. Oh, good, he put out 2 liters.
That's the metric. That's how we define success.
But is it really the right metric?
It's a proxy, and sometimes it's a very poor one. You can have what's called a water diuresis, where the patient loses a lot of dilute fluid, but they hold on to all their sodium. That doesn't fix the underlying problem in heart failure at all.
The ultimate goal isn't to produce urine. The goal is to achieve sodium balance. The goal is hemodynamic stability.
We should be treating the patient, not the Foley bag. Are they breathing easier? Is the edema in their legs going down? Is their blood pressure stable? Is their heart function improving? Don't get seduced by a big number in the urine output column.
That feels like a really powerful place to land. The kidney is this incredibly intelligent, adaptive system, and our interventions have to be just as intelligent and adaptive, not just brute force.
Use the map, know the territory, and respect the system's ability to fight back.
For all of you listening, this is the perfect time to go back to the source material. Open Kat Sung to the chapter on diuretic agents. Look at those fantastic tables on drug properties and interactions. Then open Goodman and Gilman's chapter on pharmacology of renal function, and look at those detailed molecular diagrams of the transporters, the NKCC2, the NCC, the ENSE channel. Visualize the machinery we've been talking about.
And just always remember that everything is connected. You pull on one string in this web, and the whole thing moves.
Thanks for diving deep with us.
It's a pleasure.
We'll see you on the next one.